I understand you are at home. You have kids behind you. That's great. So for the second session, we have other topics on this Danone case, which will be the basis of the course, guideline of the course today, which is first to go further what's happened after the operation, the complex operation with convertible bonds of an acquisition on Saint-Gobain by BSN Danone. What's happened there in terms of strategy. I try to explain very quickly what's happened. I will come back again in a minute on that. And then second, we will move into the horizontal acquisitions. Third, into the vertical integration, explaining the different elements from the potential choice between hostile and friendly operation, the payment, the means of payment, problems of integration and restructuration, because always remember that this question of mergers, of integration, are very important, but they are raised only after the acquisition. So this is for today. To summarize what we did yesterday, I said at the beginning of this session, I will summarize what's happened. To start with a new through what I call presentation 15, and I use about 7 slides out of 10 there, showing some dimensions of the acquisition and mergers. And second, we started with the case study, BSN Danone, and we started in 1966, a long time ago, with 2 medium-sized firms merging together under the direction of the same CEO, and after that trying to develop their activities with an ambitious project, which is to buy the #1 in Europe on in the glass industry. Remember that the characteristic of this offer, it was first hostile. Second, it was very original in terms of means of payments, convertible bonds. Last time it was the first operation of that category, I would say, in Europe. And even today, hostile operation paid with convertible bonds, you don't find so many. So this is very complex, very specific case, and this allows us to have a discussion on why do we use convertible bonds and not more classical means of payments. It means cash in shares or cash or shares. The offer was a failure in terms of strategy. It means the target, its bank, also introduced another player. The other player is what we call White Knight. White Knight is at the beginning is an ally, but very often the ally become the final buyer, and that's what's happened. The White Knight, the ally, bought a substantial share, about 1/3, a bit more 1/3 of the shares of Saint-Gobain, and in the next annual meeting, they decided that their own CEO will become the CEO of their friend of Saint-Gobain. And 2 years after, they organized the merger between Saint-Gobain and Pont-à-Mousson. That means for BSN, it was a failure in terms of strategy. It was profitable in terms of cash because they were available to resell the 7.5% they bought for 10 during the deal with against cash with profit. But third, particularly, it was a very positive operation. First, because they learned how to manage difficult, large, and complex operations. And second, because the operation itself offered a free advertising campaign, in fact, to the firm, which is a B2B firm, and which was not known at all by the financial community and, of course, by all the citizens in the country. And after the deal, it is clear that the name of the company, BSN, and the name of the CEO, Antoine Riboud, now is very well known in the country by anyone. So, if you put into balance the positive and negative elements at the end of the deal, is probably also positive for BSN Danone. This is what we can say here on this operation, which is one of the well-known acquisition in Europe. It's still, 60 years after, it's still in the books. It's supposed to be one of the best case and example we have to present and to teach in the classrooms. So when we are at that stage, that means that the group BSN Danone is still spread between the two main activities. In fact, all are glass, but on one side it's packaging, on the other one it is flat glass. But that's two very different industries in terms of balance sheet. Flat glass needs a very high level of investment, long-term maturity loans, and it's a high fixed costs industry. A culture, and it's a culture of engineers. On the other side, for packaging, balance sheets are very different. Payback periods are much shorter. The funds needed are medium term, and it is clear that there is a marketing dimension which is there, and which is probably the beginning of a culture which will be dominating the group 15 years after. It means a marketing culture replacing an engineering culture. So this is where we are at the end of the first session yesterday. And when we are at the end of the first session, we went through these different slides here. And in fact, the last slide I used was this one, slide number 6. We have to move to a second step. Because, Antoine Riboud is still very ambitious. He learned a lot through Saint-Gobain operation, and he wanted to go further. And as we said, he had several other possibilities. The first one was, of course, to try to buy other companies in the flat glass, but the number of them was quite limited, and they were medium size. And if he decided to do that, it will be a horizontal strategy of acquisition and probably of merger, partial or 100% total merger afterwards. And second, he had also the possibility to use a vertical approach. It means to try to integrate into BSN firms which are already its customers, producing water, producing beer, for example. It means the kind of products which are sold with the bottles, and to integrate, these two elements, making synergies there and increasing the margin, because the margins are higher on the final product than on the bottle on the glass. So he decided first, and you are here with slide number 7, to develop a strategy in the flat glass industry, finding an alternative solution to the failure in terms of strategy of the operations on Saint-Gobain. And of course, as number 1, Saint-Gobain cannot be bought. Number 2 is not to be sold, building done. We find other possible target in Europe. There was no more in France, in fact. So he had to go in Europe. And in a few years, in about 4 years, they bought a lot of medium-sized firms, I would say. If you have a look to this slide in front of you right now, you understand that it was a tremendous increase. Have a look to the level of sales, which is moving from 850 to 2,661. It means you multiply by 3, multiplied by 3 in 4 years, which is enormous, in fact. I will not go into the detail, but he bought, in fact, 11 firms. They bought 11 medium-sized firms. And you have 1 or 2 examples here. Acquisition of DETAG in Germany in 2017, merger with Delog also in this country, and the acquisition of Glavebel in Belgium, which was already, which was bought by Mekendiver, which was first bought by BSN Danone. Okay, so we had several transactions, and I don't want to go through these transactions here. They were acquisition. You will see in a few minutes how they were paid. But what I'm interested in fact, is about the restructuration. Because when you buy 11 firms in the flat glass industry, and you are already in the flat glass industry, you know very well the characteristics of the business, of course, and you are able to optimize the restructuration, which means first to organize mergers when they are needed between all these legal bodies to reduce, in fact, the costs, to create synergies also. In fact, these 11 new firms plus the old one, Boussois, were organized around 3 main holding companies. The first one is Boussois, which is already known, listed on the market, what originally listed on the market. This is the listing of BSN Danone now. And it is French-based. The second one is Glavebel, and Glavebel is a holding company now located in Belgium, and Flash Glass, the third one, is located in Germany. So that means that under BSN Danone, for the flat glass, you find after restructuration 3 holding companies: Boussois in France, Glavebel in Belgium, Flash Glass in Germany, and then subsidiaries, of these holding, which are operational firms producing and selling, the flat glass. So it's a complete restructuration, a complete reorganization. And of course, during this period of time, all the teams of BSN Danone were working very hard. Engineers, of course, but also control managers, accountants, human resource managers, to optimize the system and to find as soon as possible the synergies which can be obtained. Because we go into the details, but remember that what we are interested in terms of synergies is, of course, the total level of synergies for the income and for the cost, but also the net present value of this synergy. So, time is short, and we have to obtain the synergies as soon as possible. So, in fact, when you have that kind of operation, you understand that you have steps. The first one is to define what you want to do. It's ready to define what you want to do. It's not an opportunity. We see opportunistic acquisitions and merger later. It's clearly a strategy which has been prepared, and the consequences and the different steps were forecasted after the failure with the operation on Saint-Gobain. Second, they prepared very well all these operations because they needed to buy a large number of medium-sized in order to increase the size of BS and become a real competitor to Saint-Gobain and to Pilkington, to become as big or bigger than Pilkington, the number 2. So you have to define the targets, to study the target, to analyze them, to make a priority list, and start with operations of negotiations. You prefer, of course, it saves time and limit risk to make friendly deals than to have to develop 10 or 11, hostile offers, which will be very, very difficult. And some companies, anyway, were not listed, which means it wasn't really impossible to have a hostile offer. So preparation of the deals, after the choice of the targets, preparing also an order, a ranking of the operation was important. Third, we had to go through this negotiation to organize the means of payments, and then fourth, they had to restructure, not only to restructure the group as a whole, but to restructure the different companies and to organize potential mergers and obtain the synergies which are needed to increase the return on this operation. So this was a tremendous success. But it is clear that after this operation, BS Danone is more and more a flat glass producer. It means more oriented towards the culture of engineers, of balance sheet, with a need for very long-term resources, fixed costs, and personal risk, which is quite high, even when the markets are not only the stock market, but also the economy are booming, very high return. So that's what happened during that period of time. And this is the horizontal operations. What is happening also progressively, is that if you can obtain this, the group, in fact, it's split between different activities, and progressively the group is moving from a structure with flat glass and packaging nearly 50-50. This is what you see in 1966 to something which will become, and we'll see why in a few minutes, with a minority of the activities in packaging and large, let's say, 2 parts in flat glass, and progressively more and more in the food activity. So, next step, after the initial merger which created the group, after the Saint-Gobain operation, after the horizontal strategy and the series of mergers and restructuration after friendly negotiation, now you find the diversification. It was clear at that stage that there was no more room to develop the group in the flat glass. That means the European market was really structured with three main players. There are still marginal players, but very marginal. And for BSN Danone, which was now nearly equal to Pilkington on the position of number two, there was no real other opportunity to become bigger and to become the number one in Europe. So the potential strategies to increase the size of the group, to become a bigger player in the European industry was to try to do something like to find another strategy. Of course, they could have decided that there are a good engineering team and perhaps a good engineering team with flat glass could enter another industry with long-term investment and financial resources like cement or steel, something like that. But they had, another opportunity which is based on their production and sales into packaging, and packaging, which in fact will never, it will never be, one of the fundamental set and kind of operation in the group, but it is the basis of the organization of the new activity into the food industry. That means when you produce bottles, to put it simply, packaging, it's mainly bottles, you have a great opportunity, which is to put something into bottles. And after the operations, horizontal operation, it was decided to try to develop a vertical integration. It means to buy or to create, and very quickly it will be to buy, and not to go scratch, and that is impossible. Go into the acquisition of producer of water, means having springs, and of beer, and also of dairy products. So these three main developments were very quickly identified: water supply, beer industry, and dairy products. And again, when we have a look to the operations, you understand that the first choice to make this acquisition is to make friendly operation. We'll see another slide later, but friendly operations are more than 90% of the total of the operation. What we know generally, because of the media, it's hostile operation because, they take months, it's coming from the media, you have discussion, you have several proposals, you have counter proposals, and so on. But the largest number of acquisitions is negotiated very carefully and secretly between teams with the head of the banks. We'll come back on the banks later. And what was decided here, what was decided was to go, into first the beer market. And there was opportunities. The beer market in Europe at the time was quite segmented into a large number of producers. If you have a look to the market today, you have two interesting evolutions. The first one is a large concentration which occurred for the last 20 years with several producers like Heineken, Heineken in Vietnam, Carlsberg, Anheuser-Busch, for example. So you have 4 or 5, but after that, in the economic sector, you get also on the other side small firms, very small firms, very often. A few persons, very often very limited number of persons, 5 or 6, something like that, and they decide to create scratch a new brewery to start with a brand, and they sell their products. And a large part of them are very successful also. It means this is an industry today where size, economies of scales, internationalization, large sales networks is a strength, and they are very successful, and they are very profitable. And on the other side, you have some room for small, creative, small firms with showing agility, flexibility, able, to adapt very quickly to a new demand from consumers. So at that time, we were in the first step, the step where your medium-sized traditional firms, which grew with domestic investment mainly for some of them, through acquisitions for some others, were at the end of their independent life. That means if you have a look to all these markets, progressively concentrate onto 2 or 3 big players, and after that you have very small engine, new creative players, and the medium size is progressively disappearing. And here in the country, we were at that stage. And you find here 2 producers. You read this letter on the slide. They are ECB and KROSEB and KRO, what we call SEB and CRO. Okay, they are 2 independent firms. These independent firms are family-owned firms. Family-owned firms are controlled by families. They have been growing in a different way. CRO is a family which makes domestic internal investments. They created new brands on themselves, and they didn't go on the market to buy other firms. SEB, on the contrary, and this is demonstrated by the last column on the right, has been made through acquisitions. So it's more heterogeneous, it's more complex as a firm than CRO is. But both of them are controlled by families. Anyway, they are controlled by families, but we have got also prices easily because we have got prices because there is a minority stake on the market. So it started with a negotiation of DSM Danone and the President Riboud, the CEO, the chairman, with SEB, SEB, if you prefer, CEO and board, in order to acquire this company. If you have a look to the data here, you understand that this is the first line. This company owns 27% of the market share of the beer industry in France. 27%. It's the largest, number 1 producer of beer in the country. And it is, as I said, organized around several companies which were bought in the last 10, 15 years. And really restructured. I think they were kept on the holding partially listed for minority stake on the market. And with the 11 companies, they had also 20 factories. And remember that what we know in the beer industry, that you have to develop two strengths. The first one is economies of scales. It means when you have a big brewery, your individual costs, the unitary costs are lower. But the second one, more and more on competitive markets, it is agility. You have to be flexible to develop flexibility and agility. It means quick answers adapted to the market. And in fact, they were not good on these two criteria. They were not good. The consequence is that even with 27% of the market, you find there's a level 377, and after the negotiation, the price was 326. The interest of this data is that if you compare the price and the level of sales for SCB to the same data for Crowe on the second line, to understand the value is probably not made with the same multiplier. 370 divided by 281, it's nearly 1.5. 3.6 divided by 377 is less than 1. Okay, so in fact, the structure, the fact it was not restructured, the fact synergies were not obtained, were not, it was not the goal to find the synergies, are such that the value is quite low for a brewery, for number one, the leading producer in Europe. You see that it will be paid in cash and shares, and we come back on the point later. For Crowe, same negotiation a few weeks after. When you make also acquisition and you have a strategy, and the strategy is to become clearly the number one on the beer market in France and one of the largest players in Europe, you need to be lucky. If you want to negotiate, you have to find on the other side, in the companies which are your target, you need to find a team which is open to a negotiation and a potential sale of the assets they are managing on their own. Okay, and that was the case. That was the case here, which is that doesn't happen often in life. So Crowe was a better organized, structure, and managed firm. They had only two factories. Two factories located in the eastern part of the country. One of them is in a suburb of Strasbourg, and the name Crowe is coming from the name of a small city, which is a suburb of Strasbourg, which is Cronenbourg. And the other one is in the southern part of the Alsace region, which is in Obernai. So it's a very regional. It's a very regional firm, very well managed. Economies of scale are there. There is a concentration of the production. Production of cost production are low and optimized. So the quality of the management is very, very different, and the situation of the firm is very different from SEB. So that's explained that for 14% of the market instead of 27, they paid a higher price, 370 compared to 326. And if you compare 370 to 281, the ratio is much higher than for SEB. So it's a kind of interesting situation with two acquisitions of firms which allow the buyer to obtain 41% of the market, and clearly the leading position on the French market in a few weeks, but with management situation, financial situation also, which are quite different. And of course, what's happened in that case is that after these companies were bought, SEB was clearly very quickly restructured. And when you take SEB plus Crowe, you have 11 plus 1, which is 12 companies. And this number of companies was clearly reduced to one company. And after that, after the restructuration, the only company surviving after the process of restructuration took the name Crowe Narbour, and Crowe Narbour is still a brand which is well known, at least in Europe, and which is one of the leading brands in countries like France or Italy or Spain. That's what we have. And second, which was much more difficult, because to reduce the number of companies from 11 plus 1, 12 to 1, it's the work of the financial legal team. But the most difficult problem is to reduce the number of factories in order to have more productive factories, to benefit from economies of scale, to reduce the fixed costs also, and the cost of production of each bottle of beer. And this was done not in a few months. This was done on a 5-year period. It took several months, but that's a few months, about 6 months, to move from 12 companies to 1. But after that, it took about 5 years to reduce the number of factories from 20 plus 2, which is 22, to 4. And at the end of the process, we have only 4 factories with a total production and a total level of sales higher than it was at the beginning of the process when the negotiation started. And this was a tremendous success. Just a tremendous success. It was a tremendous success. The group Kronenbourg, it becomes a group in the beer industry, a subsidiary of BSN Danone, a group of beer producer factories in the beer industry. Became the basis after that of 2 main elements of a strategy. The first one was to move from the situation of a French dominating producer for more than 40, 3 years after 45, 46% of the market, to a European producer. And Kronenbourg will buy for BSN Danone. Kronenbourg is a subsidiary of BSN Danone, and Kronenbourg will buy companies, acquisitions, and all of them were friendly acquisitions of large producers in different countries, and mainly in Spain and Italy. And they bought, for example, the 2 leaders in Spain, Maheu and San Miguel, and they bought Pironi in Italy, which is the number 2 in the country. And they become, large players on these markets, starting with a European policy into the beer industry. One of the lessons, the second lesson of that, is that with this acquisition and reorganization, restructuration, with at the end 1 player, dominating player in France, they had a beer activity, beer operations, which are important in the group BSN Danone. And when you have a look starting from that period of time, it means, let's say middle of the 70s, and have a look to probably the data, which is the most important one, which is the capacity to produce free cash flows. You understand that the beer industry, in the food industry, or in the beverage industry, is the best producer of free cash flow. I remember when I was working in the financial department in Danone, what was said in meetings is that, Kronenbourg, they produce beer and they have a good market share, high market share, and we develop a European strategy right now, but also for the group as a whole and for financial department, they are the number one in the group in the production of free cash flows. And you will see later, in our steps, 20 or 25 years later, that this analysis, a beer producer, well managed, well restructured, is a producer of free cash flow, is a strategic element. It means it is the best way to get the financial resources you need, or at least a large part of the financial resources you need to go through an acquisition policy. So the group is in the beer industry. We are, in the beginning of the 70s, and the group is not anymore in the beer industry. I will explain why later. But it stands in the beer industry to the end of the first 10 years of this century. Now it's not anymore. And during all that period of time, the free cash flows issued from Kronenbourg and other players they bought and restructured, mainly in Spain and Italy, but also in Belgium and Germany, for example, were one of the main sources of free cash flows, of financial resources, which allowed the acceleration of the acquisition strategy. Always remember that this group has been made in the long term, 2/3 by acquisition. And when you make a large number of acquisitions, you grow very quickly. You have 2/3 of acquisitions. Explaining this growth, you need financial resources. And the easiest way, if you can, to obtain financial resources is to produce free cash flows. Now, this was the first point, here. This was the first point, and we had a second one, second target. After becoming a very well-known producer and leader in the original country in the beer industry, it was also decided to use bottles to put water inside. So we can sell your bottles with beer inside, you can sell your bottles also with water inside. And again, I did not underline this enough, perhaps. Same Crowe were customers of BSN Danone before the acquisition, okay? And in fact, they bought their bottles of beer, and at that time was only bottles to sell beer. Only to two producers. The first one was Saint-Gobain, and the second one BSN Danone. Which also means when you are the number 2 producer in Europe and in France, of course, of bottles, and your customers have only the possibility to buy to another producer, which is Saint-Gobain, the bottles they need, you are in a very good position in terms of competition versus Saint-Gobain. If you buy your customers, you integrate your customers, and these customers will need bottle, you can produce bottles and you can eliminate your main competitor in the beer industry, which is the main source, the main market source for selling bottles to the potential user, potential customer. So you have to understand also this competition in terms of integration, which is competition between the duopoly of producer of bottles of beer. Now the second element here is the water supply, and it's a market which is, I would say, more difficult than the market of the beer, because you can create a brewery anywhere. You can decide to open buy land and do a building and buy equipment and start your production and so on. They succeed or not, but you can do that. If you want to produce water bottles, you need a spring. And you need a spring with a certain number of quality. There is a list of criteria to take into account, medical ones, but also the taste of water, the fact it is sparkling water or not, the level of salt inside, and so you don't have, and the level of production also, because the level of production, is a condition to high level of production to be on the market, to get market share and to develop brands. So the number of potential, I would say, good springs available in the country is not so large. And in Europe, we had leading sources, leading springs of water. At the same time, on the sparkling and non-sparkling market, which are quite different in terms of consumption characteristics, behavior of a buyer. So it was decided first here, after an analysis of the market, analysis of consumers, an analysis also of the firms which could be available to be bought, that it was better to start to create a position, to obtain a position on the non-sparkling water, natural water. Okay, and they were looking for the possibility to make an acquisition. They wanted to make an acquisition if it was possible, which was negotiated, friendly offer, on one of the leading firms in Europe, and there was not so many. And after several discussions, we had meetings with the shareholders, the board, managers of Evian, Société des Eaux d'Evian, which in terms of level of production was at the time the number one in terms of number of bottles or liters sold on the European market. It was a family-owned company. It was a firm listed on the stock market, but it was controlled, in fact, by a family. The number of stake available on the market, around 20-25%, was a minority stake, and it was spread among a large number of individual investors. So negotiation was not too difficult, and after several weeks, they signed an agreement, and Evian was Société des Eaux d'Evian. It was the Evian company, if you prefer, was bought by BSN Danone. But when you buy a company, because what do you want? You want to be able to use the spring, huh? And the spring is located somewhere. Huh? And this spring of natural water, non-sparkling water, is located in Evian. Evian is a small city, huh, in France, but on the border with Switzerland, on the Lake of Geneva. Hmm. And when you buy a spring like this one, what you buy generally, it's not the spring itself. Very often, it's not the spring itself, but it is a right to use. It is a right to use for 99 years the spring to produce bottles of water. And you have constraints on that. And for example, the constraints here was to develop employment and to lock it to have not only the factory but also other services like marketing services located in Evian. It's also to run around the springs other activities, tourism, medical activities. You have a spring, it can be used by the doctors. You need to run hotels, you need to run baths, for example. And if you have wealthy customers in the hotels, you need activities to provide other activities like restaurants, like the casino. Casino has to be was there, and you have to run all that. But those of you working in companies in financial management team, you understand that when in your group you get a subsidiary with a casino inside, it's really something completely new. We didn't know at all what were the problem of a casino. We understood it was risky, but we had no experience. So sometimes, you buy a difficulty when you buy a new company and a great opportunity in terms of diversification and extension of your operations. So inside Evian company, there was the right to use the spring, but constraints also due to the location and the agreements with the city of Evian. Second, when you buy a company like Evian firm, because you want a spring, very often you find inside the firm you are obliged to buy. This is not you don't negotiate for the spring, you negotiate for the firms who have the right to use the spring and to operate the spring in the factory. Okay? But in this company, you find something else. And if you want the spring in Evian, you have to buy the company. And here, what was found, what was found was a second spring. A second spring, which was in sparkling water. Evian is not sparkling, non-sparkling, and Badois, you see the name here, Badois, it's a non-sparkling, it's a sparkling water. Evian non-sparkling, sorry, Badois is a sparkling water. It's not located in the same area. It's about 250 kilometers from Evian. It's west of Lyon. It's in the Massif Central, not in the Alps. Okay, it's another part of the country, and Badois at that time was clearly underdeveloped, and the market in Europe for water was still very limited, in fact, compared, for example, to the beer market, and was mostly a non-sparkling water market. And we are just at the beginning of the quick, high growth of the sparkling water market in Europe. So it was not expected to buy a sparkling water spring, but it was a great opportunity, really a great opportunity. So, you know, decided to keep Badois Spring. I could have decided to sell Badois. After the acquisition of the Evian company, we decided to keep it and to develop, to invest around the spring in order to increase the production progressively when the market grew, and also to modernize the factory, to extend the marketing team, and so on. So it was probably, and it was not, expected, one of the best investments of the group. The group bought Compagnie des Eaux d'Evian, Evian Company, because of the spring of natural water in Evian. They got in the basket the sparkling water spring. They decided to keep it, and at the end, the return here was extremely high, very, very high. And 10 years after, Badois was the #1 spring in France, and it's still today the #1. And it is in competition, with another spring in Italy, which is belonging to Nestle. And also the group, BSN Danone, learned a lot on sparkling water springs with Badois. And after that, bought progressively other springs in different countries, particularly again in Spain and in Italy, and became today, if you have a look today, they are the #1 European producer of sparkling water. So sometimes, that's happened. You buy a firm, you buy a company. In the company, there is a kind of marginal operation department. You didn't buy, you didn't come there for this department, sparkling water here, but after a few years, you understand that it is a great opportunity, and you use your experience acquired through this operation in order to extend your strategy and to buy other companies and to use your experience to integrate them properly. So all these acquisitions here were done, on a friendly basis. And very often there was opportunities found without forecasting them, and which were very useful afterwards. In this Evian company, we find also another element. Another element we found was baby food. So this is a very interesting point. They bought company, Evian company, for reason I try to explain, in order to operate the spring of Evian. They got Badois also, which are tremendous success. If you make an analysis on 30, 40 years. But they found also baby food factories. Baby food factories, were small. They had brands, very well-known brands, but all brands, the kind of brands which were known by my grandmother. Okay, Jacquemin and Fallait, baby food. Factory located in another place, north of Lyon, completely independent, from the factories in Evian and the factories of Badois. Nothing to do. It was a kind of medium-sized activity integrated into the Evian company. Okay, and the group didn't have, of course, any experience or didn't have goals to develop the baby food industry at that time. They were interested, as we said, by the water because of this problem of vertical strategy.
and they fund baby food. So, okay, for baby food, you can use also your capacity of production of glass for packaging. But that was not the goal. So the question was raised very quickly. We have bought this Evian company. We are very clear on the non-spring natural water. We analyze the spring water market in Europe, and you think, it's a kind of good investment for the future. Probably return will not come very soon, but at the end it will be very profitable. But now we are on the baby food market. It's not in our core business. It's don't have any experience. We don't know the market at all. It's quite far from the water supply market. What to do? It's there. It is in the company we buy. It means, in a few months, if we sign, we have a large market share on the French market. And you see that it's about 60% of the market. If you add the market shares on Evian and Badoit, 30% of the total market share of the water production in France, which is quite nice. It's number one position. But for the baby food, it's a dominating position. But nothing outside, nothing outside France. And if you consider the European market, they are quite small in the European market, but because you have big groups working on the baby food industry, and they are only number 6. So the question was really what to do. We need the financial resources, of course, to pay for all these acquisitions. Do we have to keep the baby food here? Do we have to develop and invest in the baby food to become European? Do we have to sell or to resell to a larger producer the baby food department of Evian company? And this question is quite important and will be raised, you see that several times. When we make an acquisition, you buy a company, but you buy a company with a specific goal. And very often when you buy this company, you find inside, other assets which are not in your core business. Do you keep it? Do you keep this company and modify your core business? Or do you say, okay, I have a core business, and all the operational activities, investment, which are not in my core business, I just sell or resell them. Okay? And you will see that several times we had this situation. It was decided, just to keep it and have a look. It means to postpone any kind of decision. And this was done with the baby food. It was done, in fact, with the spring water. Very quickly, it happened to be a success, and the group invested again in Badoit factory and bought Landraja in Spain, for example. For the baby food, it was not so clear. It was just kept year after year without any clear decision. We are in the 70s. And you know what's happened at the end? The group stayed as number one on the French market, extended marginally its activities in other European countries for years. But you will see that they moved in 2006 only. We're at the beginning of the 70s, 2006. It means what, 30, 35 years later. And at that stage, for other reasons I will explain, they decided to resell the beer, resell other departments, and invest in the baby food industry. And they bought the number one in Europe at that time. I will explain that. It was a Dutch company. And it was a great opportunity for them in 2006 to have this acquisition 35 years before. Because of the meantime, of course, they had a good knowledge of the market, they developed products, they have the necessary team to integrate new acquisition, and particularly a large acquisition, which is in 2006, the number one in Europe. And I will talk later about the baby food industry, in more details. But you will be surprised, the baby food industry is still a growing industry, even today, in countries like mine, where the birth rate is not so high. It's declining progressively, So I can say the birth rates are declining, but means the market, it's better, and perhaps it's also declining, but not, it's still a growing market. And why is it still a growing market? For several reasons. The first one being the fact that women are working more and more, and when they are working more and more, and their mother is not taking care of the kids as they did before, that means have to simplify their life, on the cooking. Also, the second point, is that baby food products are used for older kids than before. It means if you start giving baby food to your kids for 2 years, and after that, a year, a few years after, give them baby food products for 4 years, that means you double the market, double the market size. So marketing is very good, to increase the size of the market, and what they do for baby food, convincing the mother, but life is much easier with baby food. And then something we cannot ignore is that, at least in Europe, today, and it will never be said by the producer of baby food, they had a great success to increase the size of the market. About 30% of the total sales are made with persons over 70 years old. That means the baby food has a taste also which is quite acceptable for old persons, and the market of old persons is increasing very quickly, in many countries, and even in Vietnam. And the future of the market is there. So when you buy in 2006, the number one in Europe, at the time birth rates are declining, it's still a good investment, because the mother behavior, and because the structure of the population, and the percentage of products bought by old people. So anyway, they got this baby food activity as a marginal activity. They didn't know what to do with that. They just decided not to make a decision. And at the end, now 45 years after, it was a very good decision. And if you do that, look to the returns on the different activities, this is one of the best returns today. So, you have to be very careful, make analysis of acquisition on their success, on their returns. So this is for beer, and this is also for the water, let's say, and baby food activities. So I'm there with slide number 11 right now. Here, and you find something, or another acquisition, which is the third one in this strategy at the time of vertical integration, which is the interest they had in dairy products. And dairy products, as you understand today, it's mainly yogurts, but it's also, of course, dairy, cheese, for example, and some desserts which are made partly with dairy products. And this is a strategic decision forever, I would say, for the group here. They had the opportunity to buy one of the largest producer of dairy products, yogurt and dairy products in Europe at the time. But the situation was a bit complex, and I want to explain why the situation in this is quite complex. And the acquisition, which is underlines through this table here, is the acquisition of a company which is called Gervais Danone France. It means the name Gervais has disappeared since that time. It's only kept for a few limited number of products. And Danone, we have a success, it become a brand, a main brand of the group, and also the name of the group later, 22 years later. Dairy products at the time were sold in packaging in glass, which is still the case today, but it is a minority case at the present time. And they bought factories, in fact, they bought knowledge, they bought brands in the dairy products. If you have a look to the price paid here and compare this price to what we have seen before, for example, on slide number 10, see the price, even if you add for beer industry, Seb and coal, you get about 700 and only 250 for water and the baby food. It's very, very low compared to beer and to the price you find here, which is more than 1 billion. So this was, the most costly operation done up to that time. And if you have a look if you compare the price of purchase to the level of sales and compare that, for example, to the beer industry, here it's one for 2.2, and for beer industry, remember that, for example, for Croix, it was just the contrary, it was more than one. So the cost is not very high compared to the cost of beer industry, and particularly well-managed companies in the beer industry. When you do the simple comparison, you understand that there is a reason. It's not random, this process. It means that the return, and particularly the production of cash flows per unit of sales, is much, much higher in the beer industry than it is in the other activities, dairy products, or even water supply. And we'll explain that later, but the fact they keep today, for example, the water supply is because the brands are very useful. Evian is more a brand that production of water today, which is used in many different operations, sometimes very far from water production, like sports, like leisure, like luxury products also. So over time, it is moving, and you make an acquisition at a point in time without knowing exactly what you will do with your acquisition. Particularly, you will name the brand of a company. So here they had an opportunity to negotiate. It is a friendly acquisition again, and they had an opportunity to buy this company, which is Gervais Danone France. Today, they get, the we are the owner of Gervais-Danone, but Danone as a whole in the world. It was only in France at that time. You should understand the story, and you should understand that you have to adapt to the circumstances. You have to be very clear on your goal, but to adapt. This is a good lesson, good lesson. This company in France was run by one person, in fact, as a family, but it was the real owner and the real manager of the company. He was getting old. You are at the beginning of the 70s. And he was the owner of several companies called Danone in different countries. And if you want to understand what is this problem, and this is probably fine sometime, the first firm, Danone, or Danone, it depends how you pronounce it. You can pronounce it with a Texan accent also, Danone. This company was created in 1934, long time ago, in Hungary. Perhaps you don't even know where is Hungary. It's central part of Europe. It's some country, 10 million inhabitants. So this guy was a Jew living in Hungary, good idea, good entrepreneur, and he started the company in 1934. And in the years after, 1935, by 2 years after the creation, there was a new government in Hungary, close to the German government at the time, and the Jews were persecuted and decided to leave and to move to Spain. Now, it's like the students, he likes very much Barcelona. And he went to Barcelona and thought that Barcelona was Spain and the democratic countries. It was by the beginning of 1936, and he created a new Danone company, Danone Spain. And very soon after, the civil war in Spain started. In 1939, March 1939, that was the end of the war, and it was won by the General Franco. And again, he thought he was not in a safe country, and he moved to France. But you are spring 1939, and 1 year after, France was invaded by the Germans. Okay. In the meantime, he created this company, Danone France. So that means, he created several Danone companies, but they were not big companies. He managed, in order to keep independent companies one from the other. It means Danone Spain, Danone France were not subsidiaries of the original Hungarian company. They were independent company. He was the owner. He managed to keep the ownership during the war. In 1940, he decided to move to the US. He was a refugee in the US, and he created another company 1 year later, which is Danone US. During the war, he worked in the US, and also he married, and he married with an Italian woman. And after the Second World War in 1946, she convinced him to move to Italy, and he created Danone Italy. So this is a group, Danone, created by a guy who was a refugee. And each time he was obliged to move, he created a new company. And he was influenced in his last choice by his wife, who thought that Milan was better to live than New York City. And, you are at the end of war, you are in 1946, 1947, and the firms grew after that. He managed properly with different firms. No? And you are 30 years or nearly 30 years after, and he doesn't have any, he didn't have any children. And he decided he was very friendly, very friendly relations with CEO of BSN, and he decided to make a deal with Antoine Riboud, the CEO. He sold Danone France first to BSN, to Antoine Riboud, and you will see that he will get shares against. It means he became a shareholder and one of the most important shareholder of the group. So this is, not a partial merger, but this is a partial acquisition of a group which is not completely a group, which will be paid in shares with the original CEO of a part of the group Danone bought by BSN, which become one of the main shareholders of BSN. And you will know what will happen later. But when you are the CEO of BSN and you have that kind of situation, of course, you have a strategic analysis, and I will go back again a few minutes after the break, the strategic analysis. And you conclude that you have to buy progressively all the Danone companies in the world and to get the brand, and that the brand will be in the future one of your main assets. So anyway, you get the first time, you get the Danone, Gervais Danone France subsidiary, you get a new shareholder, you are working with him, and you try to convince him progressively to resell to you, of course, not to others. It's other firms in Europe, Italy, Spain mainly, and then after that you want to get also the Danone US to get the brand to be developed, to develop a brand in the US, and then will be obtained in 1980, 1981. In fact, it took 10 years to buy all the Danone companies. So sometimes also an acquisition, which is a partial acquisition of the company, is the first step to integrate the company as a whole and to develop a new department which will become at least one of the most important, even if it's not the most important of the group along the history. You see also here that the price is not very high compared to the beer. And you see that we have market shares quite high in different kind of segments, products. For yogurt, it's 29% of the French market. Another competitor, which is Nestlé, and also a kind of mutual company, a cooperative producer, third one. It's a market which is nearly split in three parts. We have dairy cheese, we are number one. Desserts, including some kind of dairy products, they are clearly number one. But also something which is completely different. It's again the same story. It's again the same story we found with baby food. It is pasta. And they found the production of pasta with headquarters in Lyon. And this firm, Panzani, got 43% of the French market, nearly nothing outside. So you are coming in this acquisition, for the dairy products, and you find pasta. What is the connection between pasta and dairy? No connection at all. It is food, of course. And you cannot put the pasta into a bottle, so it's not a good example of the application of a strategy. So you are very far here for your original goal. And the question you find is really what to do. Again, you don't have experience in the pasta. Pasta is not in your core business. Or you think more and more that probably we will extend your activity into the food industry. But the concept is based on the integration of the bottles and the food products. Here there is no connection. But anyway, it was decided, not to make a decision, just to have a look and to learn the pasta market. And again, the pasta market became of interest year after year for Danone. And they bought other companies in different European countries. They were number one in France, they didn't buy anything else in France, but they bought other companies in other European countries. When you are in the pasta market in Europe, for those of you having a knowledge of Europe, you need to be somehow Italian, because pasta is Italian. And Panzani, even if it is in French firm, it is an Italian name. So you are positioning your firm always taking into account of the strength, weaknesses, characteristic, behavior of a leader. And as a leader, for example, for dairy products is Nestlé, the leader here for pasta is Barilla. It's an Italian firm based in Parma. It's clearly for the kind of pasta we have in the Western world, it's clearly the number one in the world. So they decided to invest afterwards in Italy, and they bought another firm called Agnesi, which is the number two on the market. This is also how to learn. You have an opportunity to get a pasta set, Panzani, and now you decide to stay there, and you invest by the number one, the number two in a country which is the largest market in Europe, and also where the leader is the number one, the leader in the world for that kind of pasta is located. And what you do that, you want to learn the market. You want to learn the market and to improve the quality of your products and strategy in other European countries. So this is something which is also done here. It's a very surprising acquisition. They just bought, let's say, one part of the group done in France. After that, they make an analysis and they thought that they had to obtain, the right to use the brand Danone everywhere in the world. Progressively, they integrated the CEO of Danone companies into their shareholder group, and they bought to him because he didn't have any family. They bought all the Danone company. This is in line with the process of integrating the packaging and the products. This is also in line with the development in Europe of a company. But there is this question of the pasta. Oh, it is food, but there is no connection with the packaging produced by the firm. And it is the first investment and acquisition in the food industry which is not connected to the process of production of packaging. That means you start with a vertical integration. The argument, your main explanation is to say, I want to integrate producers of products and can say with my knowledge of packaging, bottles and packaging in glass. At the point in time, you have opportunities to buy other food companies not connected with your packaging industry, packaging production, and you enlarge your core business. And this is the case with pasta. Now we have been through, this second step here. I remember we started with the creation in 1966 merger. We had this very important operation, Saint-Gobain, which is a kind of basic cases of M&A you find in all the textbooks. Then they moved to a vertical and horizontal strategy of acquisition and development. All of them were done on a friendly basis. There was Saint-Gobain operation which had clearly a style offer. But after that, all these successful operations were done on a negotiated basis. So the problem wasn't there. Problem of choice, problem of value, problem of what to do, of the department you find which are not connected with your core business, mainly the baby food and the pasta, and more for pasta than for baby food. And what about finance? Because finance is back, you have to pay for that. And you understood that in terms of finance, there was a very good argument, for the beer, because beer, even if prices are quite high, particularly for Kronenbourg, they bring the flow, cash flow, they produce cash flow. The beer industry, well managed, is mainly a cash flow producer, if marginally they produce and sell beer. And this is very central in the strategy of acquisition, because you have to pay sometimes you have to pay in cash. But what's happened here? After these years of acquisition, which increased the size of the group by multiply was about 4. If you have a look to the prices paid and to means of payments, and this is what you find here on slide number 12, this is what you find here. The total here is represented, and what you understand is that they paid more for the dairy products, Gervais Danone France, and it's only one part of Danone company. They will have to pay cash later for another part of these companies. This is the highest value. Water supplies doesn't seem very costly. And the beer is much more costly in absolute value, but also in relative value if you compare simply to the sales level, which is understandable, taking into account the level of free cash flow and the goal to produce free cash flows. And the total is 1,957. This is what you find here. And the question is, how was it financed? And it's just below there. And you understand that it was financed in shares. It was financed in shares because 94% was financed in shares. Cash for 6%. But at the same time, the bond issue and the level of debt increased by a level which is higher than the level of cash paid. It means the cash position is improved. It's relatively stable, but 0 plus. And this was paid in shares. So you have to think about that. You are finance students. What's happened when you pay in shares? 2 things, basically. The first one is that you have cash, you keep your cash. This is what's happened here. It means after that you need your cash, you still have your cash. Payment in shares bring you flexibility. Facilitate your next acquisitions. And this is always the question. Remember what I said yesterday? What you find in the books is taking into account static analysis. But what you need is dynamic analysis. You need to integrate the future potential occurrence. You don't know what will happen, if it will occur. But you have to take into account the potential acquisition. And in that kind of situation, if you're able to pay in shares and keep your cash, you keep part of your flexibility and capacity to finance future operations. So, and that dimension is good news. On the other side, what about the shares? And this is one of the problems of the Danone company, which was well managed, in fact. But that means you have two possibilities. Either you use existing shares to pay, or, and this is for I mentioned this one, you create new shares, you make equity issues. That means that progressively you will have dilution. And dilution is MAC. You have a problem of dilution. And when we said dilution, you still have two main problems. The first one is dilution of wealth. What about if we want to simplify net earnings per share? Can you maintain the level after these operations? Do you buy new companies, which even in the first year after the operation, increase the net earnings per share, which is what we call a dilution, and we come back to some example later? Or do you have a situation, where the net earnings per share is decreasing at least for 2 or 3 years before the synergies are obtained? And you have to explain to the market and your shareholders that you make acquisition, but that their wealth will decrease at least for a few years short term before increasing quicker than expected before the acquisition. So you have all this question of dilution of wealth and dilution. We'll see that again in another case later in more details. But you have also the problem of the control. And the problem of the control here is, in the long term, one of the main problems and one of the main strategic decisions of the group. That means, when you get the control at the beginning of the company, of your family, your lives, even if you are listed in so on, you have other shareholders, and progressively you make equity issues. You sell also in your family, some of the members sell part of their shares. It is clear that the control in terms of percentage of rights of votes in the annual meetings are decreasing. And the question which is raised here is, what is the most important for Mr. Wibo and the family? Is it to get to keep control with at least, for example, 1/3 of the shares and rights of vote? Or is it to increase the value of the firm, get happy, very happy minority shareholders, and increase, in spite of reduction of their control, their wealth? So that's what they have decided very early here in the strategy development, is to say, okay, we will not be able to keep a control if you want to grow very quickly, to pay partly in shares. And we don't have enough debt capacity to finance by debt all these acquisitions, so we have to pay partly in shares at least. We will have new shareholders, but the deal with the shareholders is the following one. Let's us manage the firm. We know how to do it. You will get a constant, recurrent growth in the net earnings per share, in the price of a share, in the value of your investment. So, of course, we'll have a very minority stake, and a small percentage of rights to votes in the annual meetings. But if you are happy with the firm, with the strategy, with your wealth increase, your recurrent growth of the earnings per share, perhaps you will keep us into power. And this is what happened to 2014. So you can, in some cases, be a group listed in the market with large number of shareholders, diversified, and so on. And shareholders think that it is much better to keep you as a managing team because you are the most efficient, and the most efficient for them to increase their wealth. This happened for that group, this happened in our industry. Number one, for example, gas, liquid gas, which is air liquide, the French. The same situation today, and same situation for the last 70 years. You probably know, I probably said that already. Microsoft is a good example. When Microsoft wanted, to make a distribution of dividend in 1995, the first one in the life of the group, was in a position in the annual meeting of the majority of the shareholders said, no, we don't want that. Keep the cash, don't distribute cash, because you are able to obtain a return on that cash, which is much higher than what we can obtain outside the firm. So you have that kind of problem behind, Acquisition is not something independent for the strategy, not independent from the value you can create, not independent of the cash flow you can produce. All these points are connected, And at the end, the central point is really the capacity to produce free cash flows. This is what I wanted to show you here. And you will see, if I come back to what I said yesterday, if I come back to what I said yesterday, is that one of the problems with kind of companies is that they cannot pay for all their acquisitions in shares. This is, here, a tremendous period of time. 68 to 73, 74, we have growth. In Europe at that time, we have 5 or 6% growth rate a year, which is very high compared to what we get now, or we get back, high growth rate. But now with the final stage of the wave, what we call wave 4 of the pandemic, but we are coming into wave 5 now. We have about 6%, but it's 6% for a semester. Then it was 6% regularly, which for developed countries is enormous. Now, when you get that kind of situation, you have bullish stock market, and you have a bullish stock market, everyone is willing to be paid in shares. It's much better than to be paid in cash. Potential return is higher. But when the markets, are bearish or unstable, it's much more difficult to pay in shares. Sometimes you can pay in shares, but only for part of your acquisitions. For the other part, you have to pay in cash. Or if it is bearish, you have to pay 100% in cash. And remember also this problem of distance and offset criteria I showed you yesterday. These are acquisitions, in the original country, which is France. When you move outside, it becomes more difficult to pay in shares. Our image is not the same, the liquidity of a share is not the same. you find seller who don't want to become your shareholders, you have to pay in cash. So this is a very specific situation. When you find that kind of situation, it's a kind of window you have to take the opportunity to use in order to grow very quickly without using your cash position. And this is, of course, the dream of CFO, to be in that kind of circumstances, in order to be able to accelerate the growth, the acquisition policy, investment, of course, with the ability to pay in shares without too many difficulties in managing after that the balance sheet structure. So this is what I wanted to show you here. Now it's time to have a short break. We have 5, 7 minutes, 8 minutes break, and we will go into summary of that, and then to other elements, I would say, to the next step of the presentation of this session. Thank you very much. We have a short break. Thank you. Okay. So, okay, I think you had a short break. That's probably enough for this session. And my proposal is really to start again with the second part right now. So we were, we are here. We were here with the means of payments, with the amount of different payments, comparison between the price of the beer industry, the water supply, the dairy products, and the situation of this company, which is now showing some kind of dilution. But you will see that it is mainly a dilution of control, not a dilution of wealth. And a stable position in terms of cash means they have protected the financial mix we can use in the next operations. Now, if you go back to this financial structure, what you see is something important, which is still what I explained yesterday, and you find it has been really applied here. What we call the net worth, in fact, is total equity, and on the other side, we get the debt, long-term, medium-term debt. And what you see is that even with this very high acquisition policy, very important acquisition policy, is multiplied by 4, more than 4 of the sales level, you still have a debt equity ratio, which is about 30%, 25, 32, depending on the years, It means very low to compare to what is potential, the higher potential for this group. Very good financial situation, a business which is not very risky. It's not the level of risk of a kind of business. They are good position, very often leading position in the country. So they have that capacity, and they keep that capacity. And this is really their policy to maintain their ratio at a level of 25, 30% in order to be able to finance that operation using the long-term contract, multiple option facilities contract they have signed with the bank. And what we will see is that because of the environment here, because of their capacity to convince the seller that to be paid in shares is a good decision, they kept their debt capacity. And the project was to use their debt capacity to accelerate the acquisition speed in the future. But what you will see in a few minutes, it is that you don't know what the circumstances will be, political, social, economic circumstances, and that, 1 year later, we will be confronted to a crisis, the economic crisis, which is, I would say, the most important crisis, economic crisis, since the Second World War. So no one was prepared to this crisis. If you have a look to the media at that time, it's growth, and everyone thought that growth would grow forever, 5-6% a year. But that was the end of this period of time. But in fact, with this debt capacity available, with this debt equity ratio very low, we were in a position to be able to deal with the unexpected coming crisis. You will see that in the following steps, we will use several times with debt capacities next period of time to meet and survive in a crisis, but after that also to finance very costly acquisitions. But anyway, when the goal is reached, the second part of the policy is to come back to a ratio of 25 to 30% in terms of debt equity. You have the opportunity to work for years with this group, and I still know very well, the last CFOs, the last two CFOs, and I raised this question several times. What is your goal in terms of debt equity ratio? Still the same. That means 2015, 16, and now 2020, 21. Same goal for the same reasons as it was in the middle of the 70s. So what you find here is a few data, on the group itself. And you see that all these elements of performance are positive, but you understand that we have equity issues, number of shares increased enormously, net earnings, net profit also, and more than the number of shares, which is quite positive because that means at the end, the net earning per share is going up. And you will see later, one part of a speech given regularly to the shareholder is a recurrent increase of the net earnings, net profit per share, which is about 12-13% a year. And they will be in the food industry afterwards. And to get 12 to 13% return regularly on the net earnings per share in the food industry is good performance. And the shareholders are waiting for that. And if you don't reach this result, you have to explain this, and that will happen in 1990 first. And now we try to explain you how to solve this kind of situations and difficulties you find, because your message is, okay, it's not 13% anymore, perhaps it's 2%, but don't worry, because in 5 years from now, it will be 18% instead of 13 and 2. But the problem is that your shareholder group is not waiting for that. This is not the kind of shareholder group which is accepting waves in the net earning per share and the price of a share. They want some kind of constant growth with a premium regular premium over the risk-free rate. Okay. Now, if you have also a look to the market value, you have a tremendous increase. So this is something positive for everyone. The market value, which allows to issue shares at a good price. The net earning in general, net earning per share is nice for shareholders. The only problem is that is the dilution of control and management process of a shareholder, communication to a shareholder, the satisfaction of a shareholder will be very, very important as a criteria in the future to maintain speed and accelerate the speed of the acquisitions. And now you see what's happened in that group. You understand that I even didn't mention that, but at the beginning, you know, what very marginal activities in the food industry, and the group was split between two activities, the flat glass and the packaging. But progressively, the situation moved. And at the point where we are, out of these waves of acquisition, integration, you know, the group is more in the food industry than in the other traditional historical activities. 1973, you get 52% of the sales in the food industry. 52%. Okay, and it is increasing regularly. And you understand also that we have invested, the group has invested in the flat glass, which means that in terms of percentage, it is flat glass activity is decreasing, but in terms of absolute value level of sales, it is increasing, but slower than the food industry. On the other hand, packaging is not developing, instead as it was in terms of number of units of production, in terms of level of sales, but in terms of percentage of the total level of sales, packaging is decreasing. And what's happened if you analyze the situation right now, which is very different from the 66 situation, it is that we have a group with a dominant, which is food, okay? We have a second pillar, which is flat glass. We have a third activity, but which is not a pillar anymore, which is packaging. Packaging is dependent, it's kind of appendix of the food industry. It means we have to analyze a group with two pillars, food and packaging. And packaging is useful because you produce food. And on the other side, you have the flat glass. That's the situation. Both of them, these two pillars, have increased the level of sales in the last period of time. But now the majority of the activity is in the food industry. Two main problems behind. The firm is still managed as a flat glass producer. Financial strategy, internal management, decision structure. It is, you know, still living, the firm is still living with its history. And the future is not there. And this is the second part. There is no correlation. There is no good practice which has been transferred from one activity to the other. They are completely different. It means we have a kind of group with two firms inside. The first one in the flat glass, the second one in the food industry. And if a group wants to be bigger, want to be one of the main players in Europe and perhaps in the world, they have to choose between both activities. And they have to adapt the structure. They have to adapt the financial policy. They have to adapt the management style to these changes. And this is already there in 1973. The choice is not completely made. They try to maintain both activities, but it is clear that they cannot stay like that very long. And that progressively, taking into account the situation of flat glass market, with a dominant position of Saint-Gobain, the growth of food market much higher compared to the growth of flat glass market, they will have to move to the food and probably to resell the flat glass and to concentrate their resources in the food industry and to, after this disinvestment in the flat glass, to reallocate the financial resources in an accelerated growing policy in the food industry. With the question of what is food, can they invest in all the segments of the food industry, or they have to prioritize some of them? And what will be the criteria of this priority? So that's where they are at that time. Okay, so when you are there, you start with another step. And the other step you have is the period which is from 73 to 80. And the world become completely different. And this is what you find here on this slide. It was a kind of Far West growth, optimism, no risk, a world of no risk. And now risk is coming back. The situation is more difficult. The crisis is there. And, the situation is that there was no experience of crisis. The war ended in 1945. We are in the middle of the 70s, 30 years after. The generationist power is different. They don't have any experience of crisis. And they are confronted in a few weeks to a new crisis, a very different crisis, which was not expected at all, and which is mainly a crisis in the flat glass industry, even if the crisis is only a general crisis of the economy with consequences in the different economic sectors. And I said it's a crisis in the flat glass industry. What's happened, in fact? The basic element is the increase in the price of oil. You understand that even now, the price of oil is an important element of the cost structure of many firms, and particularly of some industry like this one, flat glass, steel industry, cement industry, and some others. But today we have made improvements in the use of energy. At that time, there was no policy of reduction of the consumption of energy. It was, it was for nothing. It was $2 for a barrel. $2, even if the value of the dollar was much higher than today. Okay. You understand what's happened even today with a reduction of the consumption of oil and energy. When you have an increase in the price of oil, or maybe decrease in the price of oil. And the last month, we had a tremendous increase in the price of oil from nothing, March 2020, several days with negative prices on the buy, negative prices. Cannot believe that. Up to 10 days ago, it was about $85 a barrel here in what we call the Brent, and we were back yesterday at something like 73. It means, even in a few days, we can have a decrease of $12 out of 85, which is what, 1/6. So it's a very volatile price. Consequences on the other prices of other energies, and of course, consequences on the cost of production and the income statement of the firms. And the consequences were much higher at the period of time because, the oil, the use of oil was more dominant in many countries, particularly in Europe. And the shock was much more important than it is right now, because there was no economies of energy, no limit to consumption of this energy. So when you have that kind of situation, it's a direct costs on the income statement of that kind of production, flat glass. It's also an indirect consequence on the operation level of sales, because the growth in the economy is going down. Growth rate went down by from 6% to something to 2% in a few months. And that means when you have a kind of decline, it's not decline which affects mainly stable industries, not volatile activities like food, but mainly, that kind of activity like the car industry, like the cement industry, like the construction activities, steel and so on, which are declining by much higher growth, by much higher rate. So their demand declined, their sale level declined, their cost increased at the same time. And that's happened very often if you compare to what we know right in the present situation with the pandemic. There was a technological challenge. It means the process to obtain, flat glass, to have to produce a flat glass was completely changed with introduction of what we called, and you see that on the second line here, float glass furnaces. Float glass furnaces. It means, to simplify, the dominant technology before, what we call the classical flat glass furnaces, were furnaces which are not automatic at all. It required high level of high number of staff, and the orders were managed one after the other with their specific constraints. Now we have a kind of automatic computer-based system, reduction of number of staff needed. Orders can be managed, treated much quicker. Reduction of cost of production, so everything was simplified, modernized, and that means that in a few months, the traditional, or most of the traditional, largest part of the traditional furnaces were not competitive anymore. And on the side, for those who wanted to stay into the operation, other furnaces were needed, using, integrating the float glass technology. So the producer like BSN were confronted to a situation. First, reduction in demand. level of sales. They have behind a social problem, what to do with the workers. And if you want to stay into the competition, they had to invest in new furnaces and to shut down a large part of the old ones. And this is what you find here on that slide. During the period, the 7-year period, the last part of 73 and the last part of 79, let's say, January the 1st, 1980, flat glass, classical flat glass furnaces, which are, the historical sets of a group, 24. Most of them were shut down. And at the end of the period, only 2 of them were still operating. On the other hand, they built very quickly in the last period, 73, 2 new furnaces based on the flat glass technology, and they increased this number to 7. You understand that if you made just the total, but you had 26 furnaces at the beginning of the crisis and 9 at the end. That means at the same time reduction in the production and capacity of production, but also, those new furnaces have higher capacity of production for each of them. It means economies of scales were also introduced in the process of modernization. So smaller number of furnaces, adapt a few of the old, only 2 of the old furnaces to the new circumstances, and they created, they invested in 7 new furnaces, lower number of furnaces, modernized, adapted to the new competition and to the new demand, and with economies of scale, lower cost of production, and so on. So the capacity of production went down and was clearly adapted to the new level of the demand, 5,800 tons to 4,700 tons per day. This is per day. And the number of employees decreased by about 1/3. It means they have to shut down the furnaces, they have to fire the teams they have employed for years, or have to find solutions for them progressively to readapt to the new technology and to find for part of them new jobs in other than new investment. But worker in the flat glass is not a worker in the food industry. It's different. It's an apprenticeship to go through. It's very often it's not in the same location also. So that's a kind of social problem you find in crisis period, where you have a problem demand of location sites, factories you have to shut down, and modernization and increase in productivity. So they were confronted for the first time to that kind of problem. And you see that in another case, one of the main element of a strategy was a human resource strategy, which said, okay, we are obliged to shut down production sites because of the evolution of the market, because of the evolution of the technologies also. But we had to take care of the workers to find a solution for each one. It means have a new job in the new furnaces, or a new job in the same city or around with another firm, and we have to finance the timeline necessary for them to learn the new expertise they need, or we have to finance the retirement process of some of the old workers. So it's a new kind of strategy, situation, and this has to be, all these elements have to be taken into account into the decision of investment. There was clearly two possibilities there. The first one, what they decided to do, modernize, invest, be competitive, be one of the best players on the European market again after the crisis, one of the most competitive player at least. And the other one was to say, okay, this industry, is too costly, it's too risky. Just shut down all these furnaces, and it will be a loss in our account. But after that, we move to the food industry and forget about the flat glass. They decided to restructure. But when you decide to restructure, it doesn't mean you decide to keep the furnaces afterwards. And that's what they will do. They will say, okay, it's less costly to modernize, restructure, and to resell afterwards when after the crisis, the demand will increase again, with and a very competitive tool will be sold for a good price on the market. It is much better than to shut down right now. It will take a few years. High level of resources will be invested in the project. But after that, it will be, for the group as a whole in the long term, a good solution. But that means also that in the meantime, you reduce your acquisition policy. You reduce your growth in the sector, economic sector of the future, which is the food industry, or at least some segments of the food industry. Yeah. So that's what it is. But the problem when you have that kind of situation, is what is the cost? How to finance that? And how to manage this transition period? So this is, here we are. Sorry, I'm lost. I was here, 17. Yeah, 80. It's a very simple table you find here. Very simple table. Then this is the requirements in terms of financial resources. And this is always a problem of cash flow and debt capacity. Operating cash flow coming from a flat glass, not from a firm as a whole, is the second line here. It's 817. Okay. But your plan done with your engineering team, says that the need to modernize is 3,099. So you find a difference of 2,282. So that means the cash flow produced by the flat glass cannot finance the restructuration, or at least will finance about 1/3. The 2/3 have to be funded with another resource. And they did not have the cash in their hands. So what to do? So you're in the middle of a crisis, you can have several answers, and you have to choose between the answers. The first one would be to say, okay, we have operating cash flow, perhaps, which are more important in the other activities, packaging and food. We can use these cash flows. So you have a look here on the same period of time, of 7 years, of all the cash flows expected from the food business, which is here, 3,365, okay? But they expected also level of investment just to maintain, the level of the competitive level, 3,480. So it was very quickly decided that the cash flow of the food business will stay in the food business, will finance the industrial investment needed in the period, and marginal resources were needed, but it was easy to finance. Same situation on second line, packaging. So that means there is no cash flow available if you want to maintain in line with the competition level, the food business and the packaging. And the flat glass with the 817 cash flow will have to find other financial resources. It's not the cash flow produced by the other two activities we can finance the flat glass restructuration. So other resources are needed. If there is no free cash flow available, that means we have to find other ways. What could be the possibilities? What could be? One of the possibilities, which was also analyzed, was to resell immediately some other activities. And there was an argument saying, okay, in this acquisition, we have, for example, both baby food and the pasta. Do we need to keep the baby food and the pasta? And for two reasons, it was not used as potential financial strategy. The first one, clearly, is that it was not sufficient to finance the necessary amounts. And the second one, is that the prices of all the firms declined during that period of time, and they declined very much. If you have a look to the stock markets in a few months, by the end of 73, beginning 74, we declined by about 30%. So that means, they will have resold these assets at a price which is very low compared to what we can probably obtain later. And anyway, it's not sufficient. So they had to find another possibility. If you cannot finance by the cash flow, if you cannot finance selling some assets, what is left? Only two possibilities. Classical ways to finance the assets. And the first classical way to finance the assets would be to say, okay, let's ask the shareholder to bring some more cash, they have received good dividends, high dividends. They have the net earnings per share has been increasing regularly. So they can, in the crisis, bring new resources, equity issues will be very useful, improve the debt equity ratio. And if they bring 100, perhaps we can obtain new loans for 100. Anyway, this was not a very good solution also. Why? Because you will see that in several tables after that, after this one, the price of a share, of course, went down. And if you make an equity issue when we have a bear market, it's you bring dilution to the company and to the shareholder. So the last point was to say, okay, perhaps we have another solution. And the other solution is to use our debt capacity. Because remember what's happened. They kept 25 to 30% debt equity ratio. They signed also multiple option facility contracts with the banks, and they didn't use, in fact, this contract, these options, because we were able to finance the payments by shares. So they still have that capacity, they still have the contract. It means the risk, the liquidity risk is now in the hands of the banks. And one way to solve the problem is to use these multiple option facilities, which were negotiated and signed to finance acquisitions. But no one at the time of the negotiation expected that crisis, economic and financial crisis, will come. But now we are in the middle of the crisis, and the easiest way to finance the restructuration is to use this debt capacity. Of course, the debt equity ratio will increase, and at the highest point, it went up to 130% before declining very quickly. And but it was really fine. And you see what's happened to the balance sheet structure if we simplify the balance sheet structure. This is the bottom, in fact, of this table here. The long-term debt increased very quickly. We had losses, so we have a small decline of the total equity level. And the interesting point is that what you find between the end of 73, the end of 79, is the debt equity ratio went up from 32% to 88%. Okay, even if the 88% position in 79 is not the worst one, when more than 140% in 75, 76. So they started reducing the debt position in the last years of the crisis. So the refinancing of the restriction operation was done and successful because they used an instrument, a tool, which was designed, negotiated with the banks for another purpose, for another goal. But that's happened very often also. You are in an acquisition policy, and suddenly you have a crisis, you have to restructure, you have that capacity, you have signed contracts, multiple option facilities contracts, and you use this contract to finance your restructuration. And after that, of course, at the end of the process, or in the last part of the process of restructuration, you start reorganizing the right side of your balance sheet. It means you try to consolidate part of the debt, or you are able to pay back part of your debt, and you reduce progressively your debt equity ratio. But you understand here that at the end of 79, they still have a high debt equity ratio, and part of the policy in 80, 81, 82 would be to come back to a debt equity ratio of 25, 30% in order to be ready, to finance acquisition again, and probably acquisition in the food industry. And this would be accelerated, you will understand that, would be accelerated by the sales of the flat glass, the restructured flat glass. And this will be another story with the introduction of the European regulation. So this is what's happened here. You have a restructuration, and this restructuration is a restructuration which is made with instruments, or finance instruments, which were not created and dedicated to restructuration, but on the contrary, to acquisition and growth. Now, you find another element here, which is the analysis of the net earnings, or what we call net profit in Europe, in the different businesses and in total. If I have a look to the net earnings, simplifying the numbers here, you understand that food brings always something positive. Even if it is decreasing, it is a bit more volatile than before. The first column here, you find 146, 59, 16, it's always positive. And this is what we saw with the cash flows. The food industry, the food activities is able to finance the necessary investment, perhaps not to finance a big deal, but the usual investment able to maintain the activity, the operations, and to modernize the factories and to have some kind of new products coming on the market. It's not so bad for packaging, but remember that now packaging is a kind of appendix of food. It's not so bad, but anyway, you find negative data on 2 years, on 75 and 76. So it's more sensitive to the crisis than the food industry itself. It's also explained by the level of investment, which is a bit higher, with more fixed costs, even if the fixed cost level is not the fixed cost level of the flat glass. But you understand that the problem, is on the flat glass industry. 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79. You will find negative data. Oh, yeah, you feel better starting in 76 because it seems that the negative data in absolute value are improving to 133 in 75 and only 62 in 79. But it takes time to recover. Right? It takes time to recover. And what you have really to manage, it's total for the group. And this is something of interest, which is the negative value in 75. Now, if you have a look to all these data from 1966 to 2020, and this will be the same for 2021. Well, close to the end right now, they are positive. Sometimes very positive, sometimes a bit less positive, but always positive. This is the only negative data for net profit, net earnings in the history of the group. So it means for them, it has been the most difficult crisis. Okay. So you understand we have to concentrate on the flat glass industry. I move to slide 22, excuse me. So there's another discussion here in slide 22. Another discussion, which will be one of the last discussions for today, which is what about the price earning ratio? And this is an interesting element, If you have a look to your textbook, they say it's not very important at the end, it's not just the result of calculation. We have a count on one side, net profit, net earnings, net profit, net earnings per share, and then we decide that get the stock price of the market. Then we just make the calculation. And if you take 991 divided by 102, it gives you 9.7. What is the question? What else? Nothing. Okay. And sometimes you compare price earning of industry to the other, or to one firm in the industry to another firm in the same industry, in fact, to find consequences or conclusions. It's probably more interesting what it is said in the textbook. And we are really involved in that kind of process. You understand that you have to find something from the price earning. You have to find something. The first one, of course, if you have a high price earning ratio, that means when the analysis of the market and the investor in your company, incorporate growth rates, potential growth rate for the future, and that if your price earning is going up or is higher than those of your competitors, it means that your potential growth rate in the future is good and higher than the one of your competitors. So it's a good indication of a potential growth rate of a company. Or also, if you take the averages of economic sector, potential growth rate of economic sectors, compare one to the other. Okay, fine. Second, you can also think that there is another dimension in the price earning. And the other dimension you find in the price earning, it's a kind of dimension forecast. It means the changes in the price earnings give you some information on the future steps. For example, here, you understand that in the month of 74, no one believed that the crisis would be a very difficult period of time. It was thought that it was just a kind of very short-term movement. This is what is said today, on inflation, for example, interest rate, or on the price of oil. Same kind of approach. I know it's moving, but don't worry. In 3-4 months from now, it will be over, and we'll come back to the traditional data. That means it was not integrated by the stock price, by the stock market. And of course, if you have a net earning which is decreasing and very quickly, and a stock price which is decreasing but less quickly, you have an increase in the price earning, which is counter-intuitive, of course. That no calculation possible in 75 because of the negative value for the net earning per share. And suddenly, the price earning went up 76, 77. And this is the interesting point. When after the most difficult period in a crisis, you find these increasing price earning and up to levels which are not the traditional level of the economic sector. Let's say traditional level of the economic sector in this glass dominant industry were about 8 or 9 in average. And you find something which is 25 and next 79, something enormous. And this is the announcement of the success of our restructuration. That means that the market believe in the restructuration and believe that the net earnings will come back soon at a level at least equal to what was produced by the firm before the beginning of the crisis. And that means that progressively the financial situation, financial structure will be improved, and that a new policy, in that case of growth and acquisition, will start again. This is the announcement of a future policy of acquisition in 3 years, 4 years, perhaps. But you get a tool here, which is very simple, but which shows the intuition, I would say, of a stock market and the results of the analysis of the convergence of the analyst towards the success of the restructure and operation of restructuration. Okay, that's what you find. And this is a very useful tool. You understand at the end, when it's nearly finished, nearly over, the price earnings coming back to the traditional zone, which is about 8, 9, 7.8, 9.7. That's what we find. That's what we find here. Okay. So the result of this fluctuation, is here in terms of activities. We have an increase in the percentage of sales dedicated to food, 52 to 54%. We have a decline again with flat glass. Remember what we did in terms of situation, reduction of the number of production sites and the capacity of production. And we have an increase in packaging, which means more and more it is a food industry producer, open appendix, which is the packaging. And if you have both of them, 54 plus 16, it's about 70%. Now it is a food producer with another activity, which is still an historical one, which is competitive again, but which is a secondary activity, which is not anymore the main activities. If you will derive the income statement, the investment, sales level. But you understand also, and this is another phenomenon we'll try to explain next time. In terms of price earning, the market still explain or consider the firm as a flat glass producer, as a glass producer. Price earning at the level of 8 or 9 are not price earning in the food industry. And you will see in the slides that we produce next time, which is on Monday, that for the food at the same time, it's about 14, something like that in average. That means if the market takes into account the fact it's not anymore a food producer, but mainly a glass producer, but mainly a food producer, price earning should increase immediately, and of course the stock price and the value of the company. So this is one of the problems you find in your textbook and in your finance course with efficiency. You remember the efficiency, strong efficiency, weak efficiency, and so on, semi-strong or semi-weak, depending on the word you use. You are semi-something, one at the end, semi-strong efficiency. If at the end the market takes into account your information, but does then integrate this information in a short period of time, which is the case here. They will take that into account. They will go to 13 point something or 14 in a few years. But we already know that, in fact, this is a food producer with a marginal activity in the flat glass. But this is not integrated by the market. And this is a good example of semi-strong efficiency. Go back to your Tupac and Timazo if you forgot all that. And that means that it's coming, but it will take time. And if it is coming, if it is moving to 13 or 14, that means the value of the company will increase very quickly, and of course the stock price. The situation is a good signal if you go back to another theory, which is signal theory. It is a good signal for investors to buy the share. And the data I will show you later will validate this hypothesis. This is where we are. So I've been through the restructuration. Remember that in that step, the choice was between shutting down the plants in the flat glass industry or to restructure. They chose to restructure. They didn't use the cash flows produced by the other two main segments, food and packaging, which were reinvested in these segments. but they used the multiple option facilities negotiated to finance the acquisitions in the preceding period of time. It means they accepted an increase in the debt equity ratio went up above 100%, and which was progressively managed. And at the end of the process here, January 1st, 1980, they went down to 88%. But that means at that time, end of the period, end of 79, beginning of 80, the group is mainly a food producer, but it's still organized as a flat glass producer. The culture is still an engineering culture, not a marketing culture. And the market, doesn't take really into account the change and keep the image of a group, which is a flat glass producer. Here we are. So the question is now what to do. And very quickly it is decided, it was already in the minds years before. It is decided to have a strategic movement to sell. You are M&A course, but in M&A course, you have to deal with joint ventures, you have to deal with these investments. And at that point, you will have a disinvestment policy, I would say, of a main historical kind of operation of the group. The flat glass will be sold in the years to come, and at a point in time when it will be completely sold only, the market will accept this firm is not anymore a glass producer, but it is a food producer. And at that time, only by the end of 83, the price earning in a few months will go above more than £5. So this is where we are. We have been through the creation, merger, this tremendous and very useful operation to understand what it is, how you can finance, how can use convertible bonds. But an operation which bring also white knight is important concept. And at the end, to a failure in the strategy, success in terms of cash, communication, apprenticeship. A lesson also for target managers. The only choice they have in many cases is to choose who is going to buy them. The bidder or an ally, the white knight. And you understood here that it was a white knight. Then we move to the answers to the strategic failure, which were vertical and horizontal acquisitions, which were due to the context mainly, but also to the policy of a main shareholder financed by shares. Which means at the end they kept their cash, and they didn't use their multiple option facilities. It seems they still have transferred the liquidity risk to a firm, to the banks, and they still have the capacity, to use these lines of credit for future acquisition. But the world changed, and they were confronted to a crisis. And they use these financial potential resources using their calls on the banks in order to get the debt necessary to finance the restructuration of the flat glass activity. They succeeded in doing that. And at the end of the process, 1980, they are still considered as a flat glass producer by the market, even if they are in majority in the food industry, with a management which is still made of engineers, They know that they have to move in terms of internal culture, in terms of structure, organization. They are to push new acquisitions, but in the meantime, they have to resell the flat glass to get the cash to reduce the debt equity ratio to something between 25 and 30%. That they will have. And we noted also that some elements are quite interesting there. For example, what about the price earning meaning? We have to write about that. What about the application of efficiency theory to this case? What about the application of the signal theory to that case, which are very practical application what we teach in traditional corporate finance courses. So thank you very much for these your concentration on that case and the session number 2 of this course on a Saturday afternoon for you. I wish you a nice and safe weekend. Take care anyway of you and your family and friends and colleagues. I don't know exactly where you are with pandemic right now. I can tell you that in Europe it's coming back with it means we have a new variant coming from South Africa, and new measures are taken by the governments. And for example, flights from Central and South Africa are forbidden right now. It seems we are back with the winter also coming. We have 2 degrees, two only degrees in Paris this morning. And the humidity, pandemic is back. So I don't know what will be the future anyway, but I hope it's safe for you, and don't worry, we will find successively against the pandemic. Have a nice weekend and keep safe.
Thank
Bye.
you, Professor. Yeah, take care.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. I hope you are doing well. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
See you next time. Yeah.